So we've talked about the differences between the different parenting styles that Dr. Baumann researched, and we keyed in sort of on the differences between authoritarian and authoritative, and you focused on kind of the frequency or the readiness with which each of them used corporal punishment. Can we talk about what in general the line is between discipline and abuse when we're talking about using spanking in any instance, regardless of the frequency? What kind of a spanking is appropriate and what kind of spanking is not?
Okay, I think the best way to answer that question is actually to refer to Canadian law, because I think they've got it right, pretty much. So here's what Canadian law says. They don't mention the word spanking, they mention the use of force. The use of force in discipline may be applied to children between the ages of 2 and 12. It may be applied with the open hand only. Implements are prohibited. The effect of the use of the force may only result in a temporary reddening of the skin. Anything beyond that, which leaves marks and bruises, would be considered excessive and would be unlawful. They also say that any use of force to the child's face or head is abusive and unlawful. So what we're talking about, there's a few other provisos to it, but I think those are the highlights. And what we're basically talking about is the use of the open hand on the child's extremity, the smacking of a toddler's hand, don't touch that, or typically on the back of the legs or the seat. That's what we're talking about.
So why are those things good guidelines? What informs those conclusions?
Okay. You'd have to go back to, there's research which conflates harsh and abusive treatment with what we would call the effective use of minor force in disciplining. And I'm sure there's 1,000 different studies out there that will conclude if you treat children harshly, abusively, with anger, indifference, and a lack of nurturance, that you're going to have developmentally inferior outcomes. And that's why it's important to differentiate what would be considered harsh and abusive treatment. I'd also like to step in on that because our org has put together some free resources for parents, for judiciary, for social workers, for governments. And we've actually answered that question because we've been asked quite often, where is the line between discipline and abuse? And I'm going to say right now, it's interesting that everybody looks at where is the line when using physical force in a punishment or a consequence, and yet no one has delineated where is the line when you use psychological punishments, emotional ones, verbal ones. And so we've come up with 6 criteria which we believe differentiates these two things, but not just for physical punishment, for any response type. However you respond to a child or your child's behavior, and whatever method you use, we believe these 6 criteria are common sense. So number 1 is intensity. Whatever method you're applying, the intensity should be moderate and controlled. It would be considered abusive treatment if it is excessive or with the intent to cause harm and damage. Number 2 is demeanor. However you apply a consequence or however you relate with your child, the demeanor should be one of that is loving and even-tempered. If it is of anger and indifference, then it's likely an abusive treatment rather than a beneficial one. Number 3 is the effects. As I mentioned before, the effects should be transitory and trifling, which is in our law a legal definition which was defined as no more than a temporary reddening of the skin. So inflicting some degree of lasting harm, whatever that harm is abusive. That doesn't just apply to the use of physical consequences, it can be verbal consequences. Parents who berate their children and tell them how awful they are and that they won't amount to anything is horribly abusive, psychologically scarring, and can damage children for life. It can leave scars that last far longer than a few red streaks on the seat. The fourth one is motivation. Is there genuine concern for adjusting and improving the behavior of the child? That's considered constructive. If the motivation is for retribution or not child-centered, then it probably isn't beneficial. Fifth is context. Is it in direct response to a particular behavior? When a parent responds to the child's behavior, whatever the response is, should be addressing the behavior and not something else. If it's responding to something the child could not know is wrong or for no reason at all, I would consider that abusive. Because a child cannot learn from something that they did not know and then have a consequence applied to it. And the fifth one is usage. Different consequences have different effectiveness rates, and it tends to be the more effective they are, the more stringent they are. So you have from milder on up in a progression of tools that you have to use. So consequences such as spanking, which we would put on the stronger end of the scale, should typically be availed after other methods have been tried and failed. Otherwise, it runs the risk, as any consequence does, of reducing effectiveness. Any approach, when overused, will reduce its effectiveness. If whatever the approach is constantly applied as a first response to any situation, we would not consider that constructive. We would consider that abusive.
You mentioned that those standards apply to any kind of discipline intervention, whether it's
Yes.
physical or psychological or otherwise. Can you give an example or two of what you mean by a non-physical discipline or can you show us like a spectrum
Yes.
where that might be an example?
So a very popular, so the consequences fall into different type categories. The physical consequences are generally boiled down to the definitions I gave you. And I would like to also come back to a question of how is spanking used, because there are three ways which we've identified that you would use it. But I'm going to go to another consequence type. It's called a confinement punishment. Confinements run the spectrum from timeouts to sent to the bedroom for some time, all the way up to grounding, which is typically used for older children or teens. And so there is no gradient, and there's no law that tells you beyond your own reasonable judgment what would be a reasonable timeout. So placing a toddler on a chair in the corner for several minutes, I think most people would agree that that's a reasonable approach to a confinement punishment. Locking a toddler in a cupboard for 2 days is at the other end of the spectrum. It's completely abusive and serves no good purpose and has great potential for a lot of psychological damage to that child. So somewhere in between these two extremes is a dividing line, and where is it? No one has defined it.
Are there different types of behaviors that physical discipline or other types of discipline best deter?
Yes. From our work in that school study, corporal punishment, is it effective? The effectiveness ratings tend to be higher for behaviors that are insolence, defiance, bullying, hitting other children. Counterintuitively, where a claim is made that using spanking teaches violence or teaches children to hit others, the fact of the matter is, the truth is entirely the opposite. When we've looked at real records of this, we've looked at the children who have received corporal punishment for hitting or bullying, and by and large, the vast majority of them had not received corporal punishment prior to their hitting or bullying another child, and therefore you can't link the bullying or hitting to corporal punishment. It was the unpunished children that actually did that. And when applying corporal punishment in school, it actually had the highest effectiveness rating. It stopped children from bullying and hitting other children at an effectiveness rate of 94%. That's 6% recidivism. And 94% was the highest effectiveness rating out of all the behavior types that we broke out in the records. So the fact of the matter is completely and entirely the opposite.
Does it depend on the child's age? Does physical discipline affect some children at certain ages differently or better than or worse than other ages?
Okay, that question is filled with nuances. So in order to answer that question, there's two parts to it. Number one, how is spanking used? We find that there are three methods in which you use it. There's been 4 studies comparing in real time the use of a 2-swat open-handed spank response for 2 to 6-year-olds and compared it to a spectrum of other methods and found it was equal to or more effective than the gambit of methods. And there are really 3 ways in which it can be used, and it's more of an age-appropriate thing. A toddler, two open-handed swats on a toddler can be used to stop or to de-escalate a momentary situation of defiance, a tantrum, throwing themselves on the floor. It's more of a Control-Alt-Delete on a computer that doesn't work. It basically resets everything and snaps them out of it. They now have your attention, their mind is focused on you, and they've stopped doing whatever it is that they were doing, the type of behavior that you wanted to stop. So that's number one. Number two, as a backup to other methods. So research has shown for parents who would like to use timeouts, timeout is a fairly ineffective method if you have a child that won't respect the timeout and just decides to get up and leave. If they're not going to observe the timeout, the method is totally useless. So research has shown that if the child escapes the timeout, you apply a 2-swat spank response and put them back into timeout and say, you have to sit there until it's over, otherwise the same thing will happen. And research has shown that that's very effective in getting children to observe the timeout, thereby negating the 2-swat spank response in the future.
Is there an age at which physical discipline becomes less effective or perhaps even not recommended?
Okay, so before I get into that question, I'm going to dovetail that. There's a third way in which it's used, and this is what most parents would consider the typical normative over-the-knee type spanking. And that is usually, or it should be, in response to a very specific incident that the child definitely knew was wrong and willfully decided that they were going to go ahead and disobey that anyway, fully knowing that that would be the response to it. It's a very important thing in parenting that the child needs to know what the expectations are, they need to know what the rules are, but in all fairness, they have to know what the consequence is. So when they're willfully and knowingly doing something that they know is offside, they should have an expectation of what the consequence is going to be. I want to dovetail that with just an aside and say that, at least in my own experience or anecdotally, the way that spanking works really well is because when you get to the point with a child where they're not listening to you and you can't de-escalate the situation, it often works with a warning first. So you have to turn to your child and look them in the eye and say, look, you need to stop this right now. If you don't, this is what's going to happen next. Do you want this to happen? You'll usually get a response, no, Daddy, I don't. And then, good, I don't either, so you need to stop it now. And I found in my personal experiences that that works 19 times out of 20. But 1 time out of 20, the child is going to test your limits. And it's very important, 100%, that you follow through, because consistency in disciplining is absolutely crucial. And if you don't follow through, your warnings just turn into empty threats. You've undermined your own authority, and at that point you will lose control, because they will take advantage of it. They're intelligent beings. And if they see that there's an opening, some of them are going to try and take advantage of that. I got on a tangent. Why don't you, you were asking about the age limits and so on?
Right. Are there ages at which you do not recommend corporal punishment as an effective tool?
I personally believe that our Canadian law actually got it exactly right. Under the ages of 2, the child has not developed to the point where they can relate a consequence to a particular behavior. Babies don't need discipline because they are not developmentally at the point where they are starting to learn proper social behavior and constructs for it. On the other end of the scale, that's a tough one. Because of how laws work in Canada, we can only use the open hand. Just as a matter of practicality, spanking your child up to the age 12 because of their size, that works. Once they become teens and they become adult-sized, then different methods need to be applied. Typically, like in U.S. schooling, a wooden paddle, because you're not spanking them over the knee anymore. They're usually bending over an object, a bed or a desk or something, and you would paddle them. And those types of methods are prescribed for us. So I can't really speak to that. However, there is something in our research that I think is important to that question. The older the child becomes, even when corporal punishment is a known, accepted, and expected response in their environment, the older they become, the less fearful of it they are. So they tend to ignore it as they get older, which either means you need to increase the intensity to make it sufficiently unpleasant for them, not to want to draw that consequence. But when you get into the younger cohort, we found that for younger primary age children, the deterrent effect of simply knowing that that is the response is where the effectiveness, that's the real effectiveness. It's in preventing them from engaging in the behaviors that they know would draw that response.
I want to go into some specific, more nuanced fields of your study. Before I do that, can we just get an opinion from you or a statement from you about overall, is physical discipline effective?
Yes, highly effective.
Why?
But it's nuanced because it depends on how it's used, when it's used, the methodology, and the circumstances, and the context.
You've done some research on spanking and the consumption of alcohol or other substances. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. There was a work that we published in 2015, and it was called Parental Spanking Bans as Predictors of Future Alcohol and Substance Abuse. And at the very first, I'm going to say that this work emulates a lot of work that is sort of anti-spanking material in that it is correlative work. And I want to say right now for the record, I'm fully aware that correlation is not causation. However, there are strong links. What we've done is particularly in the EU, we've looked at the alcohol consumption rates and the rate of increase or rate of decrease. So it's rate of change in alcohol consumption over time. And we've also looked at drug-induced death rates. And we found that the EU and Scandinavia is a great laboratory for this because you have many countries which have proscribed spanking for a long time, some more recently, and then many that have not at all. So we can do a comparative analysis between all of these, and what we found is there's a very direct relationship between the length of time. So I'm not going to talk about banning spanking. What you're really doing is you're criminalizing traditional authoritative parenting. That's actually what these laws do, because the intention of those laws is to drive everybody into positive parenting. But in actual fact, that's not what happens, and I'd like to answer that question later. That's a different topic. However, there's a direct link between the countries that have criminalized traditional parenting, the length of time they've done that, and the uptake in alcoholism and in drug-induced death rates. And as a matter of fact, the countries with the 3 highest rates of drug-induced death rates as of the time of that study happen to be the 3 earliest countries that criminalize traditional parenting, which are Norway, Finland, and Sweden.
Wow.
So, that's, okay, right now what we're looking at is this is correlation, not causation. But I can come to the causation part of it. And in a nutshell, and we can delve into the nitty-gritty of this, but in a nutshell, what these countries have done is they've criminalized what 5 decades of science now show us have the best developmental outcomes. And they're trying to force them into a positive parenting, which is appropriate for about 1 in 5 children. Positive parenting is an excellent system for that naturally meek, mild, and compliant child. But that's only 1 in 5 personality, 1 in 5 children with that personality type. What happens to the other 4 and 5? That's where the problem lies. And what we find is they are pushed into permissive or disengaged or aggressive abusive parenting styles, which then have substantially inferior developmental outcomes, both mentally, emotionally, and psychologically resilient outcomes. They're inferior. And when you have inferior outcomes in that way, this leads to a myriad of problems. And one of them is depression, substance abuse. These children are less self-controlled, so they tend to be more violent. And that manifests in ways. And one of the ways it manifests is in these people seeking refuge in things like substance abuse. So now we don't have correlation, now we have causation, because we can understand the mechanisms of why that observation turns out that way.
You've also done some research on spanking as it applies to sexual preferences or tendencies. Can you tell us about that too?
Yes. There was a claim that was made by someone which I thought was rather odd, and it had no scientific basis to be made on either side of the story. And the claim goes that childhood spanking sexually derails the development of that child, and as a result, as an adult, they will have an adult spanking fetish. And that person looks at as evidence, well, there's many websites geared to this type of thing, and so on. So what we decided to do was we said, okay, well, let's design an experiment that actually answers this question. That experiment was published in 2015, an empirical study of adult males relating childhood disciplinary spanking and sexual orientation as predictors of consensual adult spanking. And this actually told us the exact opposite. I'll tell you how the experiment ran. If it is true that adults with an interest in adult spanking, if the root of that was childhood disciplinary spanking, well, then what we're going to find is if we can find a cohort of these adults and survey them to their experiences, we're going to find 2 things. They are spanked at much higher proportions than the general public, and they're probably spanked more frequently and more harshly than the general public. So I found a website that was geared, it's a hookup website for adult males who are interested in corporal punishment with each other to hook up and meet and do this. It has over 16,000 members worldwide. And the wonderful thing about that website is I could data mine all the bulk data. And I ran a survey there. I sent out over 500 survey questions, I received nearly 300 responses, which was a good sample sizing. Here are the 2 most salient conclusions. Number 1, based on the survey of their childhood experiences, they were spanked at a rate of 2.7 times less than the typical adult of their age group, based on American surveys. So it's negatively correlated, is number 1. But number 2, I think, is the most revealing. The sexual preferences of each of the members and the bulk data thereof is publicly available on the website. So An American survey, a broad survey, shows that about 3.4% of adult males identify as non-straight, so that is bisexual, gay, or other. Yet, of this entire website's membership, 85% of them are not straight. So the population of this entire cohort is 25 times more in the LGBT category than the national average is. So what it really tells us is this adult spanking fetish, for lack of a better word, is really simply a mechanism of sexual expression between two adult males. And as we've already seen, it has absolutely nothing to do with childhood spanking experience, because overall these adults, when they were children, were spanked at a rate of 2.7 times less than the typical adult out there.
I don't know the data on this, but when I'm hearing you say this, it makes me wonder whether the lack of physical discipline may have encouraged the interest in this type of behavior. Do you have anything to say on that?
So I followed up with questions for all the respondents, and I found that a very small percentage, 4%, had received what they consider constant, frequent, excessive corporal punishment, and they link their own desires to that treatment. Okay, that's fine. That's how social science works. You're going to get outlier groups, and that is something that can be effectively treated in law. Those children were treated with treatments that we consider harsh, abusive, and unlawful. So that already is a non-issue. On the other side of it, there were European respondents who have grown up in spanking banned countries and were never spanked as a child. And I remember one young man telling me in particular that his interest in this whole genre is that he felt that he had an inferior upbringing and wished that he would have been disciplined as a child, because he had gone off the rails. And and getting older, he saw that looking back, it's because no one effectively responded to his behavior when they should have. And because of that, he's developed an interest where he now wants to find an older male, not in a sexual spanking, but as a mentor and disciplinarian, to try and turn his life around now as a 20-something-year-old.
Do you know if his experience is representative of any proportion of the population?
No.
Okay.
No. Just like the harsh and abusive treated people were an outlier, so too are these an outlier. They are a component. That's why social science is so complex. You can't take anything and bring it down to one issue. You're going to have a preponderance. And here the preponderance tells us two things. Number one, these sexual spanking, adult sexual spanking interests have nothing to do with childhood disciplinary experience in bulk. And number two, they most likely have to do with a sexual preference that is non-straight for these males.
You mentioned earlier that you wanted to talk about why it is that spanking bans, or what are called spanking bans, are actually bans on traditional parenting. Can you help us understand why that is?
Yes, I can. There's a resource that we created, which we hand out for free, and I don't know if you can see this, but if you'll remember early...
Displayed on video.
Yeah, early on, what we did was, based on Dr. Baumrein's work, we recreated the entire matrix of all the parenting styles, and we related them against demandingness from low to high and nurturance from low to high. And based on 5 decades of research, it's generally concluded that traditional authoritative parenting has the best developmental outcomes.
Like what?
And we've already discussed what the 4 features of that parenting style are. I would refer to Dr. Marjorie Gunno's work at Calvin College, Michigan. She's done some work in that field that shows that they, just going off memory, they tend to do better in school, they have a better outlook in life,